Order. I'm very pleased that the House of Commons has been able to help deliver an improvement to the sound and vision. Oh, that's from number 10, I think. Before I call the Chancellor of the Exchequer, I've already got that one in. I think I might push my luck. Before the Chancellor of the Exchequer addresses the Chamber, I'd like to point out that the British Sign Language interpretation of the statement is available to watch on the parliamentarylive.tv. I now call the Chancellor of the Exchequer to make a statement. Chancellor.
Mr. Speaker, today's spending review delivers on the priorities of the British people. Our health emergency is not yet over, and our economic emergency has only just begun. So our immediate priority is to protect people's lives and livelihoods. But today's spending review also delivers stronger public services, paying for new hospitals, better schools, and safer streets. And it delivers a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, creating jobs, growing the economy, increasing pride in the places we call home. Mr. Speaker, our immediate priority is to protect people's lives and livelihoods. So let me begin by updating the House on our response to coronavirus. We're prioritising jobs, businesses, and public services. The furlough scheme, support for the self-employed, loans, grants, tax cuts and deferrals, as well as extra funding for schools, councils, the NHS, charities, culture and sport. Today's figures confirm that taken together, we are providing £280 billion to get our country through coronavirus. Next year, to fund our programmes on testing, PPE, vaccines, we are allocating an initial £18 billion. To protect the public services most affected by coronavirus, we are also providing £3 billion to support NHS recovery, allowing them to carry out up to 1 million checks, scans and operations. Over £2 billion to keep our transport arteries open, subsidising our rail networks. Over £3 billion to local councils, and an extra £250 million to help end rough sleeping. And while much of our coronavirus response is UK-wide, the government is also providing £2.6 billion to support the devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Taken together, next year, public services funding to tackle coronavirus will total £55 billion. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the OBR's economic forecasts. And can I thank the new chair, Richard Hughes, and his whole team for their work. The OBR forecasts the economy will contract this year by 11.3%, the largest fall in output for more than 300 years. As the restrictions are eased, they expect the economy to start recovering, growing by 5.5% next year, 6.6% in 2022, then 2.3%, 1.7%, and 1.8% in the following years. Even with growth returning, our economic output is not expected to return to pre-crisis levels until the fourth quarter of 2022. And the economic damage is likely to be lasting. Long-term scarring means in 2025, the economy will be around 3% smaller than expected in the March budget. Mr. Speaker, the economic impact of coronavirus and the action we've taken in response means that there has been a significant but necessary increase in our borrowing and debt. The UK is forecast to borrow a total of £394 billion this year, equivalent to 19% of GDP. The highest recorded level of borrowing in our peacetime history. Borrowing falls to £164 billion next year, £105 billion in 22-23, then remains at around £100 billion 4% of GDP for the remainder of the forecast. Underlying debt, after removing the temporary effect of the Bank of England's asset purchases, is forecast to be 91.9% of GDP this year. And due to elevated borrowing levels and a forecast persistent current deficit, underlying debt is forecast to continue rising in every year, reaching 97.5% of GDP in 25-26. High as these costs are, the costs of inaction would have been far higher. But this situation is clearly unsustainable over the medium term. We could only act in the way we have because we came into this crisis with strong public finances. And we have a responsibility, once the economy recovers, to return to a sustainable fiscal position. Mr. Speaker, this is an economic emergency. That's why we have taken and continue to take extraordinary measures to protect people's jobs and incomes. And it is clear those measures are making a difference. The OBR now state, as the Bank of England and IMF already have, that our economic response has protected jobs, supported incomes, and helped businesses stay afloat. They've said today that business insolvencies have fallen compared to last year. And the latest data shows the UK's unemployment rate is lower than Italy, France, Spain, Canada, and the United States. And we're doing more to build on our plan for jobs. I'm announcing today nearly £3 billion for my right honourable friend, the Work and Pension Secretary, to deliver a new 3-year restart programme to help over 1 million people who've been unemployed for over a year find new work. But I've always said, we cannot protect every job. Despite the extraordinary support we've provided, the OBR expects unemployment to rise to a peak in the second quarter of next year of 7.5%, 2.6 million people. Unemployment is then forecast to fall in every year, reaching 4.4% by the end of 2024. Mr. Speaker, today's statistics remind us of something else. Coronavirus has deepened the disparity between public and private sector wages. In the 6 months to September, private sector wages fell by nearly 1% compared to last year. Over the same period, public sector wages rose by nearly 4%. And unlike workers in the private sector who have lost jobs, been furloughed, seen wages cut and hours reduced, the public sector has not. In such a difficult context for the private sector, especially for those people working in sectors like retail, hospitality and leisure, I cannot justify a significant across-the-board pay increase for all public sector workers. Instead, we are targeting our resources at those who need it most. To protect public sector jobs at this time of crisis and ensure fairness between the public and private sectors, I'm taking 3 steps today. First, taking account of the pay review body's advice, we will provide a pay rise to over 1 million nurses, doctors, and others working in the NHS. Second, to protect jobs, pay rises in the rest of the public sector will be paused next year. But third, we will protect those on lower incomes. The 2.1 million public sector workers who earn below the median wage of £24,000 will be guaranteed a pay rise of at least £250. What this means, Mr. Speaker, is that while the government is making the difficult decision to control public sector pay, the majority of public sector workers will see their pay increase next year. And we want to do more for the lowest paid. We are accepting in full the recommendations of the Low Pay Commission to increase the national living wage by 2.2% to £8.91 an hour, to extend this rate to those aged 23 and over, and to increase the national minimum wage rates as well. Taken together, these minimum wage increases will likely benefit around 2 million people. A full-time worker on the national living wage will see their annual earnings increase by £345 next year. And compared to 2016, when the policy was first introduced, that's a pay rise of over £4,000. Mr. Speaker, these are difficult and uncertain economic times, so it is right that our immediate priority is to protect people's health and their jobs. But we need to look beyond. Today's spending review delivers stronger public services, our second priority. And before I turn to the details, let me thank the whole Treasury team, and especially my Right Honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, for their dedication and hard work in preparing today's spending review. Next year, total departmental spending will be £540 billion. Over this year and next, day to day, departmental spending will rise in real terms by 3.8%, the fastest growth rate in 15 years. In cash terms, day-to-day departmental budgets will increase next year by £14.8 billion. And, Mr. Speaker, this is a spending review for the whole of the United Kingdom. Through the Barnett formula, today's decisions increase Scottish Government funding by £2.4 billion, Welsh Government funding by £1.3 billion, and £0.9 billion for the Northern Ireland Executive. The whole of the United Kingdom will benefit from the UK Shared Prosperity Fund, and over time, we will ramp up funding so that total domestic UK-wide funding will at least match EU receipts, on average reaching around £1.5 billion a year. To help local areas prepare for the introduction of the UK SPF, next year we will provide funding for communities to pilot programmes and new approaches. And we will accelerate 4 city and growth deals in Scotland, helping Tay cities, Borderlands, Moray and the Scottish Islands create jobs and prosperity in their areas. Mr. Speaker, our public spending plans deliver on the priorities of the British people. Today's spending review honours our historic multi-year commitment to the NHS. Next year, the core health budget will grow by £6.6 billion, allowing us to deliver 50,000 more nurses and 50 million more general practice appointments. We're increasing capital investment by £2.3 billion to invest in new technologies to improve patient and staff experience, replace aging diagnostic machines like MRI and CT scanners, and fund the biggest hospital building programme in a generation, building 40 new hospitals and upgrading 70 more. We're investing in social care too. Today's settlement allows local authorities to increase their core spending power by 4.5%. Local authorities will have extra flexibility for council tax and adult social care precept, which together with £300 million of new grant funding gives them access to an extra £1 billion to fund social care. And this is on top of the extra £1 billion social care grant we provided this year, which I can confirm will be maintained. To provide a better education for our children, we're also getting on with our 3-year investment plan for schools. We'll increase the schools budget next year by £2.2 billion, well on the way to delivering our commitment of an extra £7.1 billion by 22-23. Every pupil in the country will see a year-on-year funding increase of at least 2%. And we're funding the Prime Minister's commitment to rebuild 500 schools over the next decade. And we're also committed to boosting skills with £291 million to pay for more young people to go into further education, £1.5 billion to rebuild colleges, £375 million to deliver the Prime Minister's lifetime skills guarantee and extend traineeships, sector-based work academies, and the National Career Service, as well as improving the way the apprenticeship system works for businesses. And we're also making our streets safer. Next year, funding for the criminal justice system will increase by over £1 billion. We're providing more than £400 million to recruit 6,000 new police officers, well on track to recruit 20,000, and £4 billion over 4 years to provide 18,000 new prison places. New hospitals, better schools, safer streets. The British people's priorities are this government's priorities. Mr. Speaker, today's spending review strengthens the United Kingdom's place in the world. This country has always and will always be open and outward-looking, leading in solving the world's toughest problems. But during a domestic fiscal emergency, when we need to prioritise our limited resources on jobs and public services, sticking rigidly to spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid is difficult to justify to the British people, especially when we're seeing the highest peacetime levels of borrowing on record. I have listened with great respect to those who have argued passionately to retain this target. But at a time of unprecedented crisis, government must make tough choices. I want to reassure the House that we will continue to protect the world's poorest, spending the equivalent of 0.5% of our national income on overseas aid in 2021, allocating £10 billion at this spending review. And our intention is to return to 0.7% when the fiscal situation allows. Based on the latest OECD data, the UK would remain the second highest aid donor in the G7, higher than France, Italy, Japan, Canada, and the United States. And 0.5% is also considerably more than the 29 countries on the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, who average just 0.38%. And overseas aid is, of course, only one of the ways we play our role in the world. The Prime Minister has announced over £24 billion of investment in defence over the next 4 years, the biggest sustained increase in 30 years, allowing us to provide security, not just for our country, but around the world. We're investing more in our extensive diplomatic network, already one of the largest in the world, and providing more funding for new trade deals. We should, however, judge our standing in the world not just by the money we spend, but by the causes we advance and the values we defend. Mr. Speaker, if this spending review's first priority was getting the country through coronavirus, and its second was stronger public services, then our final priority is to deliver our record investment plans in infrastructure. Capital spending next year will total £100 billion, £27 billion more in real terms than last year. Our plans deliver the highest sustained level of public investment in more than 40 years. Once-in-a-generation plans to deliver once-in-a-generation returns for our country. To build housing, we're introducing a £7.1 billion National Home Building Fund on top of our £12.2 billion Affordable Homes programme. We'll deliver faster broadband for over 5 million premises across the UK. Better mobile connectivity with 4G coverage across 95% of the country by 2025. The biggest ever investment in new roads, upgraded railways, new cycle lanes, and over 800 zero-emission buses. Our capital plans will invest in the greener future we promised, delivering the Prime Minister's 10-point plan for climate change. We're making this country a scientific superpower with almost £15 billion of funding for research and development. And we're publishing today a comprehensive new national infrastructure strategy. To help finance our plans, I can also announce we will establish a new UK infrastructure bank. Headquartered in the north of England, the bank will work with the private sector to finance major new investment projects across the United Kingdom, starting this spring. Mr. Speaker, I have one further announcement to make. For many people, the most powerful barometer of economic success is the change they see and the pride they feel in the places we call home. People want to be able to look around their towns and villages and say, yes, our community, this place, is better off than it was 5 years ago. For too long, our funding approach has been complex and ineffective, and I want to change that. Today, I'm announcing a new Levelling Up Fund worth £4 billion. Any local area will be able to bid directly to fund local projects. The fund will be managed jointly between the Treasury, the Department for Transportation, and the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government, taking a new, holistic, place-based approach to the needs of local areas. Projects must have real impact. They must be delivered within this Parliament, and they must command local support, including from their Member of Parliament. This is about funding the infrastructure of everyday life. A new bypass, upgraded railway stations, less traffic, more libraries, museums and galleries, better high streets and town centres. This government is funding the things people want and places need. Mr. Speaker, today I've announced huge investment in jobs, public services and infrastructure. And yet, I cannot deny numbers alone can ring hollow. They stand testament to our commitment to create a better nation, but on their own, they are not enough to create one. When asked what our vision for the future of this country is, we cannot point to a shopping list of announcements and feel the job is done. So as we invest billions in research and development, we're also introducing a new immigration system, ensuring the best and brightest from around the world come here to learn, innovate, and create. As we invest billions in the building of new homes, we're also simplifying our planning system to ensure beautiful homes are built where they are needed most. As we invest billions in the security of this country, we're also defending free speech and democratic rule, proving our values are more than just words. And as we invest billions in public services, we're also protecting the wages of those on the lowest incomes and supporting jobs, because good work remains the most rewarding and sustainable path to prosperity. The spending review announced today sets us on a path to deal with the material matters of government, and it is a clear statement of our priorities. But encouraging the individual and community brilliance on which a thriving society depends remains, as ever, a work unfinished. We in government can set the direction: better schools, more homes, stronger defence, safer streets, green energy, technological development, improved rail, enhanced roads, all investments that will create jobs and give every person in this country the chance to meet their potential. But it is the individual, the family, and the community that must become stronger, healthier, and happier as a result. This is the true measure of our success. The spending announced today is secondary to the courage, wisdom, kindness, and creativity it unleashes. These are the incalculable but essential parts of our future, and they cannot be mandated or distributed by government. These things must come from each of us and be shared freely, because the future, this better country, is a common endeavour. Today, government has funded the the priorities of the British people, and now the job of delivering them begins. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
It's been a very important statement. If people were, it's run much longer, which was agreed with the Chancellor, and I think it's so important. Obviously, I've respectfully divided the time up to give an increase to the other parts as well. Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Annalise Dodds.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This spending review was a moment for the Chancellor to take the responsible choices our country needs. It was an opportunity to protect key workers, secure the economy, and recover jobs in every part of our country. During this crisis, we've seen who's taken responsibility. Community health workers working round the clock to keep us all safe. The teachers who kept working so key workers could too. The delivery drivers and shop staff who made sure we had critical food supplies. Earlier this year, the Chancellor stood on his doorstep and clapped for key workers. Today, his government institutes a pay freeze for many of them. This takes a sledgehammer to consumer confidence. Firefighters, police officers, and teachers will know their spending power is going down, so they will spend less in our small businesses and on our high streets. They will spend less in our private sector. Many key workers who willingly took on so much responsibility during this crisis are now being forced to tighten their belts. Now, not in the medium term to which the Chancellor refers, now. In contrast, there's been a bonanza for those who have won contracts from this government. Companies with political connections have been 10 times more likely to win government contracts. So many businesses have worked tirelessly through this pandemic to support local communities, keep critical supplies going, and to produce drugs and vaccines at cost price in AstraZeneca's case, working with some of our country's best scientists. But in its response to this pandemic, the Conservative government has wasted and mismanaged public finances on an industrial scale. £130 million to a Conservative donor for testing kits that were unsafe. £150 million for face masks and £700 million on coveralls that couldn't be used. A £12 billion hit to our economy because the more effective, shorter circuit breaker was blocked and a lengthier, more expensive lockdown put in place instead. £12 billion so far spent on a test and trace system that is still not working. And today, news of £10 billion in additional costs for PPE, at least partly down to the Conservatives' lack of pre-pandemic planning. This waste and mismanagement is part of a longer-term pattern, showing that claims today around levelling up simply don't match the evidence. Hospitals in Liverpool and Sandwell left unbuilt, over deadline by years and over budget by hundreds of millions of pounds. Not a single starter home built, despite almost £200 million being spent. Northern Powerhouse Rail, still not even approved, 6 years after being announced. The courts modernisation programme, 3 years behind schedule, letting victims down up and down this country. People in the north, more likely to have been made redundant during this crisis, holding everything else equal. Photo calls aren't enough. We need delivery, like Liam Byrne's promotion of green manufacturing in the West Midlands and the work of Labour mayors and councils across the country. And we need a government in Westminster that takes its responsibility towards all 4 nations seriously. That means informing the Finance Minister of Northern Ireland about the shorter timescale for this spending review ahead of time and fulfilling the new decade, new approach commitments. It means doing the right thing by the people of Wales to repair flood damage and make safe legacy coal tips. It means ending the barney between Westminster and Holyrood and instead working together in partnership to protect jobs and livelihoods. And it means a shared prosperity fund, which is effective because it's delivered not on the whim of Conservative ministers, but from our devolved governments and our regions. The Levelling Up Fund, the Chancellor just announced, his rabbit out of the hat, yet again involves MPs, just as with the Beechings reopening programme, going to ministers and begging for support for their areas, rather than that change being driven from local communities. So much, Mr. Speaker, for taking back control. This is about the centre handing over support in a very top-down manner. Now, Labour has been clear about the responsible choices we wanted the Chancellor to make today: to recover jobs, retrain workers and rebuild businesses. To recover jobs, Labour called for £30 billion of capital spending accelerated into the next 18 months, focused on green initiatives, supporting 400,000 jobs and bringing us in line with countries like France and Germany. This government's ambition is for half that number of new jobs. To retrain workers, we needed an emergency programme to support people back into work, but Kickstart has been slow to get started, and the skills offer for those over 25 won't start until April. The Chancellor said at the beginning of his speech that our economic emergency has only just begun. Try telling that to people who've been out of work since March. And Restart, announced today, must meet 3 key tests to be effective. It should help people who need it most, not cherry-pick. It should be up and running as soon as possible, yet it appears only a fraction of Restart funding will be available next year. And Restart must involve local actors who know their communities, not be imposed from Whitehall. And of course, job search support ultimately only works if sufficient new jobs actually exist. That's why we needed ambitious action to boost our economy and to support our businesses. To rebuild business, we called for a national investment bank, and I welcome the announcement of a new UK infrastructure bank, having lost valuable years since the Green Investment Bank was sold off. Now the Chancellor must boost its firepower, and he must deliver on his department's responsibility for the drive to net zero. We've known since the Stern reports that the climate crisis is the biggest long-term threat to our economy. Yet far too often, this spending review locks us into a path that will make the transition to net zero harder, not easier, locking our economy out of the green jobs of the future. To rebuild business, the Chancellor also needs to listen to business. We're less than a week from the end of the lockdown, yet we've heard nothing about whether extra support will be provided through the additional restriction support grant for areas subject once again to tough restrictions. And the Chancellor is still threatening employers with an increased contribution to furlough in January at the worst possible time for increasing and building confidence. Mr. Speaker, in less than 40 days, we're due to leave the transition period, yet the Chancellor didn't even mention that in his speech. There's still no trade deal. So does the Chancellor truly believe that his government is prepared and that he's done enough to help those businesses that will be heavily affected? Will he take responsible action also to help those excluded from government support? Why is he still refusing to make the speedy fixes to universal credit Labour has advocated, which would aid the self-employed? And why won't he provide families with certainty by ensuring the increase in universal credit is continued beyond April? The IMF has made clear time and time again that now would be the worst time to slam on the brakes and put the car into reverse. They've called for a meaningful additional push from our government to maintain fiscal support until the recovery is on a sound footing. The UK's GDP is 10% smaller now than it was at the end of last year. We've seen the worst downturn in the G7. We needed ambitious action today to stimulate growth and maintain demand. And we needed this government to take responsibility for the real reasons why people and communities are being held back up and down our country. Over the last 10 years, Child poverty has risen by 600,000. We've had the worst decade for pay growth in 8 generations. The cost of childcare has risen twice as fast as wages. The number of young apprentices has plummeted. Last quarter, we saw the highest level of redundancies on record. Social care is an increasing crisis, and despite his party's manifesto promising a long-term solution, we're still waiting. In the press, it was trailed that the Chancellor would be moving 20,000 jobs out of London, yet cuts to local authorities over the last 10 years have seen 240,000 jobs lost, 12 times that figure, with the hardest hit communities often those in the North, Midlands and South West. Today, the Chancellor could have matched his government's promise to do whatever is necessary to support local authorities through this crisis. He did not. And yet again, he showed his government's lack of confidence in its own measures by failing to provide an equality impact assessment. Mr. Speaker, the measure of this government won't be the number of press releases it issued during this crisis or the number of pictures it published on Instagram. It will be the responsible action it took or didn't take for the sake of our country. Next year, the eyes of the world will be on the UK as we assume the presidency of the G7 and of the UN Security Council and host the COP26 summit. Yet now is the time. The Chancellor has turned his back on the world's poorest by cutting international aid. It's in Britain's national interest to lay the foundations for economic growth across the world. No wonder many British businesses have condemned his move. And businesses have been more and more vocal about the problems with this government's last-minute approach, always one step behind when we need to plan responsibly for the future. We must learn the lessons from previous failures and ensure that the next challenge, the rollout of the vaccine, is dealt with as efficiently, effectively and speedily as possible. Next time, Mr. Speaker, we need a comprehensive spending review which takes responsible choices to build a future for our country as the best place in the world to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. People should have opportunities on their doorstep, not at the other end of the country. Everywhere in the UK should feel like a good place to set up home. That's what the Chancellor must deliver.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll address all the points made by the honourable member in turn. But I think it's important to note up front that despite her criticisms, I think there is, in fact, actually a lot that both she and her colleagues on that side of the House should welcome. More funding for public services, a pay increase for NHS workers, support for those on the lowest incomes, a once-in-a-generation investment in infrastructure, a multi-billion-pound commitment to support those looking for work, a new schools building programme, and the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. I could go on, Mr. Speaker. So whilst it's right that I believe the Honourable Lady should provide challenge, I think that even if she doesn't, the British people would judge this spending review as a reflection of their priorities: protecting jobs, defeating coronavirus, strengthening our public services, and upgrading our infrastructure. If there is any politics here at all, Mr. Speaker, then surely it is unifying. And deep down, I think that she will recognise that. To address the specific points, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady asked about pay and about the importance of consumption, and I agree, of course, there is an impact on consumption from pay. And she will know that the marginal propensity to consume is obviously greater the lower the income spectrum you go, which is why, in particular, we've protected the incomes of those on the lower incomes. Anyone in the public sector earning less than the UK median salary of £24,000 will receive a pay rise of £250 or more. Taken with all the other things we've done, including giving a pay rise for those who work in the NHS, this will mean that the majority of public sector workers next year will see an increase in their pay. Also, pay progression, promotions, all of that will also carry on, Mr. Speaker. We've increased wages for those on the national living wage, an extra £345 a year for those as the wage rate goes up to £8.91, and that, again, will help drive consumption. She talked about delivery rightly. We believe very firmly in making sure that we can deliver the change that we promise the British people. My right honourable friend, the Chief Secretary, and I chair something called Project Speed, which is already delivering benefits, Mr. Speaker, with plans for the landmark A66 upgrade shortened in time, reduced in costs, so we can get on with delivering what the people want on time, on budget, and making a difference in their communities. She asked about the Levelling Up Fund, and I thought rather bizarrely seemed to suggest that local members of parliament were not a good reflection on their local communities and able to articulate the local needs of their communities. But I would say to colleagues on that side of the House, I'm more than happy to hear from them and their local areas about the needs that they need met, because this government will meet the needs of local communities up and down this country, Mr. Speaker. She talked about support for businesses and coronavirus. It's because we've already put in place the support through this winter period, Mr. Speaker. The local restrictions grants that we announced a while ago are paid monthly. And they work. If your business has been closed, you will receive a grant of up to £3,000 per month, depending on your rateable value. If you are a hospitality or leisure or accommodation business in a Tier 2 area, where obviously the restrictions have an impact on your ability, you will receive a grant of 70% of that value, up to £2,000 as well, £2,100 as well. And Mr. Speaker, those amounts mean that the business can help cover the fixed costs of rent. They, of course, have access to the furlough scheme right the way through the winter. And that comes on top of the other recent support announced for businesses. Today, I announced major reforms to the way that the apprenticeship system works, giving businesses what they have long asked for, the flexibility to spend unused apprenticeship levy funds down the supply chain with SMEs, the ability to front-load payments for training that they've asked for, and we're also looking at ways to introduce even more flexibility for some professions. We also recently, Mr. Speaker, just announced an extension of the annual investment allowance for a further year, up to £1 million, giving 98% of small and medium-sized businesses the ability to write off investments in full next year, which will help drive their recovery. She talked about welfare, Mr. Speaker, and again, I would stand proud of this government and previous Conservative government's record on this issue. Since 2010, hundreds of thousands of fewer people in absolute poverty, several 100,000 children fewer living in workless households, income inequality lower coming into this crisis than it was when we first came into office. But, Mr. Speaker, this government cares greatly about those who are most vulnerable. We have demonstrated that during this crisis by the support that we have put in place. The evidence shows that those on the lowest incomes have been protected the most by this Conservative government. And that doesn't stop, Mr. Speaker. The temporary uplift in universal credit runs all the way through to next spring, providing security for those families. Of course, we will look, when we come to next spring, at the best way to support people, to support their families, when we have a better sense of where the economy is, where we are with this virus. But we are providing extra support for next year, Mr. Speaker, £670 million to help those struggling families meet their council tax bills, worth about £150 each for 3.5 families up and down the country. We have also said that we will maintain the £1 billion increase in the local housing allowance that we instituted this year into next year, providing support for many millions of families. And also, Mr. Speaker, we are making available further funds, as the House knows, to provide extra support for food and meals for children throughout the holidays of next year. She talked about support for local authorities. Perhaps she hasn't seen yet in the doc, and that's fair enough. We announced over £3.5 billion of extra support for local authorities next year, specifically to deal with coronavirus. That comes on top of their core spending power increasing at decade-level highs of 4.5%. That £3.5 billion is there to help meet the shortfall in sales fees and charges, help to meet the unrecoverable losses in business rates and council tax that they've experienced this year, and £1.5 billion for general pressures. Let no one say that we are not standing behind our local authorities at this difficult time, Mr. Speaker. And finally, she asked about green. And I think, Mr. Speaker, she compared us to France and Germany and questioned us, this government, and the Prime Minister's ambition. Well, let me say this about our plans. Our plans, I believe, are amongst the most comprehensive and most ambitious of any developed economy. She talked about France and Germany. This country, we are phasing out vehicles in 2030. In France, it's 2040. In this country, we're phasing out coal in 2025. In Germany, it's 2038. She talked about the billions of pounds that are spent by our friends. I think it's important when we make these international comparisons that we do understand the detail, Mr. Speaker, of what these other countries promise. In the German numbers, they include the subsidies for renewables. We do not. That happens separately outside of our plan and is worth £44 billion, Mr. Speaker, supporting renewable energy in this country through the tariff system, which is what Germany alluded to. They also, in their numbers, include support for public transport, which we, of course, do not, because that is something that we do just as a matter of ordinary course of business. I'm proud of this Conservative government's record, Mr. Speaker, the first major economy in the world to legislate for net zero, the economy that has decarbonised faster than any other in the last 20 years. This Conservative government will deliver the Prime Minister's plans to get us to net zero, and it's something that I hope the whole House can welcome and support. So, in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, this spending review puts the full force of government behind the priorities of the British people. And whilst we may have many disagreements with the party opposite, I am confident that in private, at least, they will recognise the significant investment we are making to protect jobs, strengthen our public services, and improve our infrastructure. We are all in this House answerable to the people we represent. It is in their interests that we serve. Today, we have made some difficult choices in order to fulfil that responsibility. But with the positive news about the development of vaccines, the winter COVID plan being announced by the Prime Minister, and the very real hope that we are finally entering the final stages of our fight against coronavirus, now is the time for us to come together. The British people have been through so much this year. Honourable and right honourable members have been through so much this year. It is my belief that with this spending review and the fresh hope given by medical advances, we can finally begin our recovery. Now, difficult decisions and all, we must deliver on the priorities of the British people.
Let's head down to the southwest with the chair of the Treasury Committee, Mel Stride. Mel Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much welcome many of the positive measures that my right honourable friend has just announced. However, inevitably, he has revealed some of the more difficult decisions that he's had to make around a reduction in overseas development aid and the freezing of public sector pay next year, not across the board, but on a selective basis. And there'll be many difficult decisions of that type, both around spending and taxation in the future. But would my right honourable friend agree with me that in terms of dealing with the deficit, it's not just about spending and taxation, it's also very much about growth? And would he also agree with me that we should look to the private sector, businesses, entrepreneurs to provide that growth? So could my right honourable friend set out how he's going to ensure that as we come out the other side of the crisis, business and entrepreneurs are given every possible support and freedom to power our economy forward over the years ahead?
Mr. Speaker, I completely agree with my right honourable friend. We will build our recovery through the dynamism of the private sector, and he's right about the power of entrepreneurship. I think the most important thing we probably can do when we think about that is to make it as easy as possible for businesses to take on new people. My honourable friend would have heard about the unemployment numbers. We want to get as many of those people back into work as quickly as possible. So we'll be thinking and looking at how we can make that as easy as possible for those dynamic businesses who are growing. At a very micro level, in this spending review, we also announced more funding for our startup loan scheme, which provides loans of discounted government-backed loans of up to £50,000 to budding entrepreneurs to start their new business.